My name is Raphael Rowe. I'm now a journalist, but I was once the victim of a miscarriage of justice which changed my life forever. In 1990, I was convicted of a murder that I did not commit. I spent over a decade in maximum security prisons. It took me 12 years to eventually clear my name. Now, I'm going on a journey to explore other high-profile miscarriages of justice to find out how the fight for many of those acquitted continues to this day.
The judges totally ignored me today. I think that shows the arrogance of the system.
I thought to myself, this is justice, it'll come out. They let me go eventually, but it took 20 years.
After all these years, the case is still unsolved.
And I'll examine the impact this injustice has had on the families of the murder victims.
He went through it all, so he knows exactly what they've done to you.
I could see, my heart goes out for what you went through.
And understand what we can learn to stop miscarriages of justice from happening in the future.
I looked at the jury and I thought, you got it so wrong. What have you done?
Toxteth, Liverpool, Friday 13th of March 1981. At 9:30 a.m, the manager of a betting shop on a busy high street was brutally murdered in broad daylight as he arrived for work. The victim was 23-year-old John Suffield.
He was a hard-working young man, and his dad, John, described him as a wonderful lad.
Detectives from Merseyside Police found his body tied up in the back office. He'd been stabbed 19 times in a frenzied assault. The attackers had robbed the shop's safe of £176. The police interviewed hundreds of witnesses before honing in on two local men, 22-year-old Ray Gilbert and 24-year-old John Kamara. Despite there being no forensic evidence, both men were quickly convicted and sentenced to life in prison.
I'm now in Liverpool and I'm here to meet John Kamara, who was convicted of the murder of John Suffield, a bookie, back in 1981. John spent over 20 years in prison fighting his wrongful conviction, and I remember him inside because we were both in maximum security prisons in the United Kingdom during the 90s, and that's where I first met him.
After 20 years behind bars, the majority of which he spent in solitary confinement, John Kamara's conviction was quashed by the Court of Appeal in the year 2000, just a few months before my own conviction was overturned.
I'm kind of looking forward to meeting him to see if he is the same character, because I just remember him in prison. I just remember this angry scouser who was not allowing the system to dictate how he lived his life. You know, he was constantly in trouble, constantly confrontational with the authorities. You know, and it's people like John, people like me, who inspired each other because no one else was there to help us.
The brutal murder of John Suffield happened at a time of massive unrest throughout the United Kingdom. There were violent protests against the Thatcher government on a national scale and riots in parts of Bristol, London, and in particular, the north of England. In Liverpool, the epicentre for anger and resistance against what was seen as police brutality was the largely black community of Toxteth. John Kamara no longer lives in Liverpool, but he's agreed to meet me outside his mother's old house. This was the location 41 years ago where John was arrested for the murder of betting shop manager John Suffield.
Mr. Kamara.
All right, Ralph.
How you doing?
All right. Yourself?
Good to see you.
Yeah.
You've aged.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
So have you.
Gosh, it's been years, hasn't it? It's been a very, very long time.
Brings back memories, though.
Coming back here.
Yeah.
Have you been back here since?
No.
No, first time. But you grew up here in Liverpool, didn't you?
Yeah, Toxteth. My mum moved here, and then obviously when I got arrested in 81, they got hounded out the house.
Tough time.
Yeah, people thought, oh, he's done the murder, and he took it out on my family.
And what about before all this happened, you know, as a young man growing up in Toxteth, what was you like? How would you describe yourself?
I was in trouble with the police from the age of 15. I think my first crime was loitering with intent.
God, there was such a crime in those days.
I did detention centre. I was 15 when I got sent there for loitering and attempted theft from parking meters.
Tell me about the arrest on the day the police came.
Well, I remember I was ironing a shirt. I think I was going to go out that night. And my youngest sister looked out the window and she went, "There's loads of police outside the house." I don't know why I did it. I dropped the iron and run up the stairs and in the loft.
Just instinct, because you've got previous.
Yeah, I got previous. And it was, you know, I mean, them days when we were younger, that was the thing. If you seen police, you ran. It doesn't matter if you went shopping with your mother.
Yeah.
I then jumped down and obviously the officers threw me handcuffs on and then took me to Admiral Street. And they said, "You've been in questioning for murder." They said, "We've got your mate." And I went, "Well, I've got a couple of mates." And he went, "Ray Gilbert." And then they said, "Ray Gilbert says it's you." And I went, "No, it wasn't me."
1 minute you're in the loft, next minute the police are putting handcuffs on you, and then you don't see daylight, as we say, for another 20 years.
Back in 1981, the crime was headline news. I want to look at how the murder was reported at the time and explore in particular who the victim John Suffield was. I've been granted access to Liverpool's Central Library archives.
This is a microfilm of the reporting of the murder of John Suffield. Betting shop boss stabbed to death. Thursday, March 19th, 1981. 2 men charged with bet shop murder. Raymond David Gilbert, John Peter Kamara. Murder hunt cache theory. Now they've named the victim John Suffield. He was 23 years old when he was murdered. I didn't realise that he was so young when he lost his life in such brutal circumstances. I've just found the obituary for John Suffield in the Liverpool Echo, dated the 17th of March 1981. So this is just 4 days after his death. And it says, John, March 13th, died tragically, aged 23 years. Beloved son of Betty and John, brother of Maria, Kathleen, Angela, Peter and Paul, brother-in-law of Gary, will be sadly missed by us all. Funeral arrangements to be announced at a later date. You know, losing a loved one in such a brutal way is cruel.
With 2 men charged for the murder of John Suffield and a city in shock at such a brutal attack, Merseyside police deployed a team of 70 detectives to gather as much evidence as possible. They even set up a mobile kiosk at the crime scene to encourage witnesses to come forward. But what evidence did they get to charge and convict these 2 young men? And how could they be sure they had the right suspects? I need to understand more about the events, not only surrounding the murder, but why the police felt they had a strong case against Kamara and Gilbert.
So this is Lodge Lane, right?
That's right, yeah.
Liverpool Echo journalist Jonathan Humphreys has written extensively about the case.
So this is
the bookies.
I mean, it's no longer a bookies.
This was Joe Correll's bookmakers in 1981.
Walk me through the timeline as you understood it.
John left his home between 9 and 9:10. He arrived on Lodge Lane and go to a newsagent's round the corner, pick up a bottle of milk and the newspapers, including the Sporting Chronicle, which he'd hang up in his shop for his punters. John left there about 9:25 and he went straight to work and began to open up his shop. Now this is where it becomes a little bit more complicated. There was a witness, Miss Edmonds, she's described in court documents, who saw 2 men she described as mixed race men in a scuffle with a white man outside this building, and that was around 9:30, she said. Other witnesses, whose evidence that the jury never heard from, were later discovered by John Kamara's legal team when they were looking to his appeal, described John Suffield entering the shop on his own, opening up for the day, nobody else with him. When the detectives entered the shop, they found a milk bottle and newspapers on a small table, which his colleague said was where he normally left them. So the appeal judges questioned whether that would have been likely to happen if a violent struggle had happened outside the shop. Detectives made their way inside and The scene they were confronted with, as you can imagine, was truly horrendous. John had been stabbed 19 times. He had injuries to his face. His hands had been tied behind his back with cable tie. And he was found in a pool of blood at the back. The offenders had tried to gain access to a safe. They determined later on that the robbers had made off with around £176.
I'm shocked at the brutality John Suffield was subjected to. At the trial, the jury heard he suffered from a stammer when anxious, which may have enraged his attackers further in trying to get the code for the safe. I'm also surprised the case was dominated by a single eyewitness account, which, unknown to the defendants, was contradicted by another witness account whose statement was somehow omitted from the trial. I want to dig deeper into this anomaly. I've got hold of the two witness accounts to compare.
I'm reading the judge's summing up about the evidence of the crucial witness, Mrs. Edmonds, and what it states is that Miss Edmonds was saying that at around 9:32 on the day of the murder, she saw, in essence, John Kamara with another man, who she couldn't identify, attacking John Suffield. And she said that was happening on the pavement outside the betting shop. That evidence was probably the most powerful evidence at the trial against John Kamara. What I have in front of me on the screen is a witness statement that was taken just a few days after the murder from a witness called Florence McCoy. Florence McCoy says at 9:35, which is after the attack is supposed to have taken place, she sees John Suffield, what she said looked like opening the gates to the betting shop, and she said hello to him. She says she was almost in the same place as Mrs. Edmonds, who gave evidence at the trial, but she witnessed something completely different. The two versions of events couldn't have happened. Either Mr. Suffield was being attacked or he was unlocking his betting shop, and that's baffling.
Toxteth, Liverpool, 1981, a district locked in racially motivated tensions between the largely black community and the police, who faced increasing accusations of institutional racism. Amidst this volatile atmosphere, two young men were arrested for the murder of 23-year-old betting shop manager John Suffield. One of the accused, John Kamara, was to spend almost 2 decades behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. In a miscarriage of justice dominated by the failure to disclose at trial witness statements which could have exonerated him. To understand the racial tension, I'm meeting prominent community activist Jimmy Jagney, who calls Toxteth, or as it's known locally, Liverpool 8, his home.
Jimmy.
How you doing?
I'm very well, how are you?
Good to meet you, Raphael.
Nice to meet you too.
Welcome to Granby Street.
Granby Street.
This is the famous Granby Street.
No, it's really colourful, isn't it? I love it, you know, I love it because I've kind of moved out of my community, which was very similar to this in London. It looks like it's got a lot of character, and you've been here a long time, right?
I've been here all my life, really. It's changed a lot over the decades. Back in the 1980s, this was really quite a meeting place for a lot of young people.
Oh, it's had a reputation. Everything changes, obviously, and the legacy of what life used to be like. But I can just see these things mean that the community is still working together. And it's a nice place to live.
Yeah, it is. Back then, during the 1980s and the 1970s, this neighborhood, this community was very much a ghetto district. We were hemmed into our set of conditions, so there was no access to jobs, access to better education.
It then went on, there was riots. And what were the riots about?
Like any high pressure situation, there comes a point where, you know, enough's enough. And for us, it was just one police stop too many. You wouldn't turn down a dark side street because that's where they'd be lurking, they'd be waiting for you away from witnesses.
It's so interesting that, you know, you're talking about the fear of doing something, not from criminals, but from the police.
Absolutely. There was a culture of this kind of police abuse going on in our community.
So when you talk about the stop by the police, what did that mean?
The whole point was to get an arrest. They'd stick their face directly in front of yours, they'd be barking out questions, they'd be talking over your answers, then they'd start prodding your chest with the finger or even the truncheon if they got the baton out. And at any given point, just the wrong move of the hand and you're being dragged away in charge on attempting to assault a police officer. on the corner of this street, just here, Granby Street with Selborne Street, that is where Leroy Cooper was arrested and a crowd gathered. And it was the reaction of the crowds to the heavy-handedness of the police which led to Leroy's arrest. And the following night, that's when all hell broke loose.
Leroy Cooper's arrest in July 1981 ignited the racial tensions in the area, triggering the Toxteth riots, just a few months after John Kamara and Ray Gilbert were arrested for the murder of John Suffield.
But this wasn't just happening here in Liverpool 8, it was happening across the country. I mean, I know where I grew up around Brixton in London, there was the uprising there.
Part of the reason why I felt encouraged to get involved with the uprising here was because of what was happening. First in St. Paul's in Bristol in 1980, and then in May 81 in Brixton. It was like, that could be me. These guys are saying enough's enough, we're not going to take any more of this shit. And they were taking matters into their own hands.
When I spoke to John Kamara, who was, himself has a legacy from these days, he talks about loitering, being stopped by the police for loitering. What did that mean back then?
This business of loitering just meant, hanging around and being black, of course, we were always potentially a bunch of criminals. I know that I can't speak with any authority on John Kamara's case, but what I can say with absolute certainty is that this business of setting people up for a miscarriage of justice, that used to happen all of the time. The impacts of a police stop potentially, go way beyond just criminalisation. It's a destructive element in the community, it destroyed people's lives.
Do you think policing in this community over the last 30, 40 years has changed?
I think the style of the policing has changed, striking that balance between getting the job done and making sure that everybody in the community is happy. I think in a more practical sense, policing can't change so fundamentally as to, eliminate racism entirely, because I believe that the whole point of policing is to maintain order. If you're on the top of that hierarchy, you're in a position of massive privilege. If you are a middle class, you maintain the wheels that turn over society, so you're protected. If you're anyone else, you are policed. And that includes a huge chunk of black people there.
I suppose the backdrop in Liverpool, especially Liverpool 8 at the time, was that there was tension between the police and the black community, and Kamara was one of those in the black community. The other thing to remember is, John was a hardened criminal. He'd spent his youth committing crimes. He was known to the police. And so it's never as clear-cut as you want it to be, but there's no doubt that what was going on in Liverpool in the late 70s, early 80s had a significant impact on John Kamara's wrongful conviction.
So when you were arrested, you then get taken to Admiral Street Police Station, which is this building here.
Yeah.
And what was that like?
Brings back memories, because I can remember, even now I'm looking at the room I was interrogated, and it's the one with double window there with
the window open. That's the room you were in, being told you were guilty of something you wasn't guilty of.
For 3 days I was in that room. They didn't open the windows them days.
What was it like, Johnny? Because, you're in there, you're being told you did something you didn't do, which then led to you being charged and then spending 20 years in prison.
Racism had a lot to do with it, because don't forget, this was the time we had the Toxteth riots. I just feel the police them days were just out to get a quick conviction.
Someone who's had a brush with the law like you have on many occasions, go in police station and say no comment, but that weren't your stance.
No,
you were telling them it wasn't me.
I was telling them it wasn't me, telling them where I was. This is when, in my interviews, they were telling me that Gilbert has confessed, and he says you was with him. They came in, threw the statement down. I looked at it, read a bit, and threw it, and then I just went a bit mad.
So in those 3 days that you were being interrogated, it was just you and the coppers saying you did it, you did it?
Yeah, I'd say I'm tired, can I sleep? They would put me in a cell. An hour, 2 hours later, new officers would open the door and say, interview, and it was just continuously for 3 days. The only time I seen a lawyer was when I was getting charged. It was just a bad experience being in there and thinking that they can just put you away for something you didn't do.
A fortnight after being charged for the murder, both John Kamara and Ray Gilbert each had a separate ID parade for 3 witnesses. Kamara was picked out by the very person, Mrs. Edmonds, who became a key witness for the prosecution. Her account of a struggle she had claimed to have seen outside the betting shop was directly contradicted by another witness, Florence McCoy, but Miss McCoy's evidence was not disclosed at the trial in 1981. In Kamara's ID parade, 5 of the 11 volunteers in the lineup had been recycled from Gilbert's ID parade, which breached the operating guidelines.
It must have been really difficult for John to stand there and talk about what happened in the police station, that we were stood outside. I mean, 3 days interrogated by the police, being accused of a murder he knew he didn't commit, like I did, almost a few years later, telling them I didn't do it, and they didn't believe you, and they wear you down. It's just a travesty that he spent 20 years in prison when the police knew that there were witnesses that could have supported his defence.
Liverpool, December 1981. Against the backdrop of racial tension between the city's black community and the local police force, 2 young men went on trial for the murder of 23-year-old betting shop manager John Suffield. One of the accused, 24-year-old John Kamara, was to spend almost 20 years wrongfully imprisoned before his conviction was finally overturned. I want to know how the trial impacted John.
How you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right.
I'm catching up with him at Liverpool St George's Hall, where the trial took place over 40 years ago.
So this is the old court building, is it?
St George's Hall.
St George's Hall, and yours was one of the last cases?
The last murder trial. Of
Really?
this building, yeah.
It's a huge building, isn't it?
It is. It's a bit frightening. There's some bad memories.
Should we go and have a look at the cells?
Yeah.
This is the remembrance, isn't it? When you see these white walls, you know.
This is it, yeah. Yeah. Oh my God.
Do you remember which cell?
This cell here. This is the cell I was in.
What memories does it bring back, looking at it now?
It's still the same, the big pavement stones and the bench.
Obviously been given a lick of paint since you were here, because I'm
Yeah,
sure there were lots of
obviously
scribbles.
I put my name on it, which it looks like they've covered it over. I think I put Johnny was here.
Like everybody
Like
does.
everyone else does.
Yeah, I've done that on a few cell walls myself.
You take the chalk off.
Oh, right, yeah, you just scratched your name in there.
See, something like that I would put on.
It's just an uncomfortable feeling, isn't it? Knowing that what people fail to understand sometimes is that you are a captive and you are powerless.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it was like they had my life in their hands, you know what I mean?
So you come out the cell and then they take you to the courthouse.
Yeah. Oh my God, this is the one.
It's a long time since I've been in a courtroom.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is the one. At the time, I was sitting here. I think the jury were on that side.
Where were the family?
The Suffield family were in this row. I think my mother was sitting like here on the back one.
Were there moments during the trial that you remember most vividly?
The way they brought in witness after witness. Some were prisoners. They brought from prison to say that I had confessed to them. They brought out Mrs. Edmonds, who was the lady who identified me from the back of the head. The police came and gave their evidence. It just went on and on. My witness was a headmaster at my sister's school, Donna. On Friday, the day of the crime, she came back to my mother's. She ran out and come home. Then I said, I've got to take you back to school. I walked up to the school. The police told the court that even though I was at the school, I could have done the murder and then gone home and then gone to the school.
Jury obviously didn't believe your witness, they believed
No,
the police.
they believed the police.
But
and
the teacher was your alibi, really?
he was my alibi. That's really the only alibi I had.
You went into the witness box and you gave evidence on your behalf.
Yeah, I give
what
evidence.
What was that like?
I just told the truth. I had nothing to lie about. They were questioning me about my alibi, and I was saying, well, where did I go then? If I did the murder, where did I go? The man was stabbed 19 times. Obviously, he covered in blood, so where did I go?
One of the other crucial moments was when your co-defendant, Gilbert, went into the witness box, because up until that point, he was pleading not guilty, despite the fact he confessed to the police.
He stood in the witness box. They put the indictment to him, and he pleaded guilty, and then he was taken down, and then that's when they said, we'll deal with Kamara now.
Most people think that when you're innocent, you go through this experience, that you have to be kicking and struggling every 10 seconds.
No.
You do it in your head, but you can't do it physically.
I know, it was about 6 days into the trial. I was sitting here and I thought to myself, I ain't going on. And I remember when they said guilty, and it was like this bar hit me in the chest, if you know what I mean.
Sentenced to life imprisonment.
Sentenced to life in prison. And me personally, I thought to myself, British justice, it'll come out. The judge will most probably let me go. They let me go eventually, but it took 20 years.
It's not often you, as a miscarriage of justice victim yourself, i.e. me, get to stand in the dock with another miscarriage of justice victim and reminisce about this old wooden panelled courtroom where you have no control over your own life, that your destiny, the rest of your life, is determined by this adversarial system. The people like John and me, when we were convicted, we were young men. It was at a time where, you know, Britain was more racist than it was today, that the police behaved in a certain way, the prosecution behaved in a certain way. And we talk about the riots and the uprising, if you like. And me and John are products of that.
John Kamara appealed his conviction for murder in 1983, but was unsuccessful. 14 years later, in 1997, a new legislative body, the Criminal Cases Review Commission, was established to examine potential miscarriages of justice, and John tried again. This time he managed to enlist the support of the then MP for Liverpool Riverside, Dame Louise Ellman.
Hello, Louise.
Oh, hello.
Nice to meet you.
Hello.
Thanks for agreeing to meet me.
Oh, that's fine.
How did you first become aware of John Kamara's case?
Well, I hadn't been elected as an MP for long. I was elected in 1997, and John wrote to me, and I looked at it and I thought, this looks wrong. And there'd been such a gross miscarriage of justice in his case. Everything I read about the case just shouted that out. I mean, the thing that impressed me so much was that he'd turned his anger about the injustice towards him to actually working for his own release, getting the information together himself.
So what, as a politician, as an MP, were you able to do at the time?
I raised it in Parliament. I made direct representations to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. I wrote to them, I spoke to them, I phoned them.
What was the response to those calls?
At first it was a kind of, well, yeah, we are investigating. We've asked Mr. Kamara to find out more on that. John was getting very angry in between.
It seemed so unfair that they were expecting him in the confines of a
he is
cell.
in jail. Been there for nearly 19 years then. I thought, no, this is not genuine. This is spinning it out. You know, he's done what he can. He's given you this information, he's given you that information. And then suddenly, it was all announced it was going to be heard on a certain date.
Yeah. All of a sudden, there's this appeal hearing.
Yeah.
But what do you think about that? I mean, we're talking 40 years on, and the family, the victim's family, have still not got justice.
Something awful happened to their son. Hard to imagine the pain and the grief. And at the beginning, I suppose they must have felt, well, someone's been caught for this and it's some sense of justice. But they realised that that wasn't right. John hadn't committed this heinous crime. And I think it's a kind of reminder to all, sometimes something awful happens and everyone wants to know, have the police got anyone for it? And the police want to get someone for a crime. Got to be the right person, or it's compounding that injustice. And there's no closure for anybody.
But I was impressed by Louise Ellman, how she felt compelled to engage with John Kamara, writing to politicians like John did in prison. And I did it. I wrote to every politician in the country because they are people of influence. They are the people that you hope can change your situation. And I got many letters with the official stamp from the House of Commons or Parliament. Even the prison guards, when they hand you those letters, you know, recognise that you've received something from someone important, because they can ask questions in places that you can't from the confines of your cell. And sometimes that can make all the difference.
Even though the campaign in support of John Kamara's appeal began to gather momentum, an unsafe murder conviction not only impacts the person in prison, but also those closest to them on the outside.
How you doing, man?
I'm all right.
Good, nice to meet you.
I'm meeting John's younger brother, Robert.
What was your relationship like with Johnny over those 20 years?
I always say to people, you just don't realise what he done, what he went through. A lot of you don't realise that he done 16 years, solitary confinement. People go, oh, but it's solitary confinement, he's on his own, yeah. 365 days a year, knowing you've got one little bit of hope, that one bit of evidence comes your way. If you don't, you know you're staying in there until the day you die. The worst part is not even one of the government, the police, or anyone, like, said sorry.
They never do.
I know. No matter how much money you throw at someone or whatever, no one come up and said, look, you got that wrong. Sorry. They don't. They just, another one we fucked up on, they are, get the bank book out, let's sign a few checks.
From what you know about the case, what impact do you think it had on your mum?
She always said from day one he was innocent.
But couldn't do anything about it as a mum?
No.
And that's the consequence, that's the things that people are unaware of, isn't it?
You don't realise that my mum died basically thinking her son was still a murderer. Even though she knew he was innocent.
In December 1981, amidst unchallenged and disputed evidence, 24-year-old John Kamara and his co-accused 22-year-old Ray Gilbert were found guilty of the brutal murder of Liverpool betting shop manager John Suffield. For almost 2 decades, John Kamara fought his conviction from prison, writing several 100,000 letters asking for help. By 1999, after the intervention of local MP Louise Ellman and the tenacity of his legal team, John was due another day in court.
I'm just reading an article from January the 4th, 1999. John Kamara is attempting to appeal against his conviction. He's wearing the same donkey jacket I remember him wearing in the years that I met him in prison. Interestingly, it also quotes John Suffield, who is the father of the victim, John Suffield, so his son. He welcomed the review. That is powerful testimony and no doubt went a long way to help John Kamara. He says, and the murder victim's father, also John Suffield, he said there must be another man who is free on the street, and this man has had freedom from conviction for 17 years. How painful must that have been for the Suffield family?
In March 2000, after 19 years in prison, John Kamara's appeal against his conviction for murder was heard in the same court I was to have my appeal in just 4 months later.
You often feel as a miscarriage of justice victim that you've been let down by your legal team at certain points. Like me, John went through a number of solicitors and barristers in the years that he was in prison in the same way I did, because You need a solicitor who believes in you, who believes in justice, who believes in the truth.
In both John and my case, non-disclosure, which is the omission either deliberate or otherwise of key pieces of evidence which might help your case, played a significant part in our wrongful convictions. I'm meeting Glyn Maddox, one of John Kamara's solicitors at appeal.
Glyn.
Hello.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks for agreeing to come and...
My pleasure, my pleasure.
What was it about John Kamara's case that struck you at the time being a miscarriage of justice?
Simply stated, Johnny Kamara, his determination, his energy, the fact that he was so committed was in a way different from lots of other cases.
And so why do you think his case was successful? And what was it that you and the barristers did?
Well, I would say he was lucky.
He was lucky. It's as simple as that.
It's as simple as that. He had a good court. He had a fair win behind him. Then there was the ID parade, was very, very suspect and was in breach of lots of the rules and guidance in operation at the time. But probably the most significant thing was 201 statements which had been not disclosed. But we knew that after the CCRC completed its inquiries and they found those statements. It was there, it was apparent that the CPS or whoever had failed to disclose those statements.
It's just mind-boggling that 201 statements didn't make it to the defence at the time of the trial.
Well, I think that's certainly what the Court of Appeal thought. This was huge, as far as they were concerned.
And then you look at what's not been disclosed and what's contained in that non-disclosure. That was significant in John Kamara's case.
The prosecution have a statutory duty to hand over everything that they have that is either supports their case or doesn't support it. Johnny didn't know about these 201 witness statements, did he? Sitting in his cell writing these letters, he didn't know that there was this sort of ticking time bomb that would have exonerated him beforehand. Shocking, isn't it?
The inability of the Crown Prosecution Service to disclose over 200 witness statements is legally relevant to both John Kamara and his co-accused Ray Gilbert. In Kamara's case, the central piece of evidence from these undisclosed statements was an eyewitness account from Florence McCoy. Miss McCoy's statement directly contradicted the evidence of a key prosecution witness at trial, Mrs. Edmonds, who had picked Kamara out at a discredited ID parade, yet Miss McCoy's statement was never allowed to be heard by the jury.
I know from personal experience, you cannot prove that the police or the prosecution or the criminal justice system deliberately withheld information that could have helped your defence. The law would say that Gilbert and Kamara benefit from the fact that the police didn't disclose that information, a point of appeal for both of them. And when the CCRC, the Criminal Case Review Commission, looked at John Kamara's case, I didn't know this, they found the 201 documents that were used to help John at his appeal.
On the 30th of March 2000, John Kamara's conviction for the murder of John Suffield was finally quashed. Not long after being released, he met the father of the man he had been wrongly convicted of murdering, John Suffield Sr.
Thank you both for coming in and joining. It's the first time you've met, actually. Just now you shook hands. I mean, this is the man who you thought had murdered your son, John.
Yes, this is the man.
Turnaround.
This is the man that I thought murdered my son. But I think anybody who sat through the appeal last week would come away convinced of John Kamara's innocence.
It's clear John Kamara's life has been dominated by the 20 years he spent wrongly convicted in prison.
This is the front cover of your prison file. Literally follows you from prison to prison.
I want to understand how he feels now about what he has suffered at the hands of the criminal justice system.
Those 20 years that you were inside, John, I mean, what did you have to do yourself to fight against your wrongful conviction?
In the 19 years, I think I wrote over 370,000 letters.
370,000 letters asking for their help.
I got a couple off Nelson Mandela.
He wrote back to you?
He wrote back and he said, just keep fighting. And then I just went, well, not a bad letter.
So I wrote to Mandela when I was inside. I didn't get a letter directly from him, but I did get one from his office.
I just kept writing. I didn't want to have the prison politics.
And so it was, what, in the year 1999 that your case was referred back to another court hearing?
April 99 it was referred to the Court of Appeal.
Did you believe that your conviction would be quashed?
Well, when I got my statements of reasons and my lawyer told me why, and then obviously she told me about the 201 statements, and it was then when the Otten said conviction granted, unsafe. But I was angry because I was saying to my lawyer, I've fought nearly 20 years to get here and nothing's come out. That's when I really panicked then.
What was you panicking over?
Where do I live? Where do I go? I can't, and I was afraid, I think I was afraid of coming out.
How did you overcome that fear? What happened?
I was worried. But then I went to stay with Paddy Hill from the Birmingham Six.
John!
Hello, Paddy. How are you?
What about you, boy? Hey? Yes, I don't.
He's another miscarriage of justice victim.
It's so disheartening, so humiliating, degrading. They don't care if you're on the street, they don't care what happens to you.
And obviously, that helped me quite a lot because he knew what I was going through. He helped me.
Yeah, as he has many other
Yeah.
people. What did it do to you psychologically, John?
Obviously, I had mood swings when I came out. When I did get my, interim payments and my compensation, I was spending like it wasn't mine. I think what helped me was meeting my partner and having kids straight away. But when my first son was born, and it was like, I've got to protect this one now. Do you know what I mean?
And I suppose there was a time like me where you thought you would never have kids.
Yeah, I thought I was too old. And now, obviously, William's 19, Thomas is 17. Now they argue, and it's sort of like, shit, man, them fucking judges have got a lot to answer for, and it was like, but no, I think they've helped, and they have helped.
Have you been able to live your life?
No, me personally, I haven't stopped, to tell you the truth. It's just continued. Even though I've come out, it's took over my life now.
For me, at the end of the day, the fact remains that John Kamara spent 19, 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The Suffields spent 20 years believing a man responsible for the murder of their loved one, John Suffield, was not responsible. And nothing, absolutely nothing, can mend the damage that has been done. Miscarriages of justice still go on today. And among all this, among all the victims that spend years in prison for crimes we didn't commit, the victims' families have never got justice.